Imagine this. You wake up one morning, rub your eyes, stretch your arms, and then, oops, there's barely enough oxygen to fill your lungs. No, you didn't forget to pay the utility bill. You're just alive, about 2 million years too early. Back then, the air was thinner, colder, and much less forgiving. Ancient humans weren't lounging around scrolling on phones. They were just trying to breathe without passing out halfway through chewing a root. And the crazy thing is, they managed it. They not only survived, but actually set the stage for everything that would follow, including, unfortunately, us binge-watching videos at 2 a.m. while swearing, we'll sleep early tomorrow. Tonight, we're going to drift through that ancient world together. I'll tell you how early humans learned to cope with near suffocation, what strange tricks evolution pulled, and what bizarre survival methods worked when the planet was basically playing hard mode. Don't worry, it'll be cozy, calming, and a little bit funny, because if you can't laugh at suffocating cavemen, well, what can you laugh at? So, settle in, get comfortable, pull up that blanket, maybe loosen your socks if they're strangling your ankles. Because we're going way, way back in time where the air was thin, the nights were long, and every breath was an achievement. Let's start with how humanity almost didn't get enough oxygen to even exist. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine breathing. Not the automatic, unconscious inhale and exhale you've been doing since the day you were born, but really notice it. That little whoosh of cool air in, the gentle warmth of it going out. Now imagine nothing. You take a deep breath, expecting that familiar rush of oxygen to dance into your bloodstream, but instead, it feels thin, empty, like someone replaced your atmosphere with a weak cup of tea. That's what the world was like for most of Earth's history. Not tea. Unfortunately, though, a cup would have been nice but thin, reluctant air, stingy with the very thing you're relying on to stay alive. The atmosphere we take for granted today, with its generous 21% oxygen content, didn't come ready packaged. Earth wasn't born with breathable skies. When our planet first formed over 4 billion years ago, the atmosphere was a toxic stew. Imagine volcanic belches, choking clouds of methane, carbon dioxide thicker than a packed subway at rush hour, and about as much oxygen as you'd find inside a tightly sealed Tupperware of forgotten leftovers. In other words, not much at all. If you or I had time traveled back then, we'd last about 3 seconds before dramatically keeling over. That's not exactly the kind of setting that encourages a flourishing Airbnb industry. Now here's the funny thing. Oxygen, the very gas we now consider the essence of life, was originally poison. The earliest microbes on Earth, the ones that thrived in hot springs, deep sea vents, and other cozy but horrifying environments, absolutely hated oxygen. It was like an unwelcome party crasher. For them, oxygen was toxic waste. They preferred sulfur, methane, and other things that would give a modern person a one-way trip to the emergency room. So when oxygen first started trickling into the atmosphere, it didn't feel like a miracle. To these early organisms, it was more like a chemical apocalypse. Oh no, Karen. The sky is trying to kill us. This great shift is known as the Great Oxidation Event, and it happened roughly 2.4 billion years ago. Cyanobacteria, the little green architects of breathable air, figured out how to photosynthesize. Picture them as tiny microscopic gardeners, busily churning out oxygen, like they were running some kind of cosmic air factory. Over millions of years, their tireless work transformed the atmosphere from a choking haze of noxious gases into something more breathable. But even then, oxygen didn't rise smoothly. It was a roller coaster, dipping, spiking, disappearing, reappearing. It wasn't until much, much later that oxygen levels stabilized enough to support large, complex life forms. By the time early humans strolled onto the scene, oxygen was finally in the survivable range. But survivable doesn't mean generous. The levels we enjoy today weren't guaranteed in the past. In fact, oxygen has had an uneven history, rising and falling like a sleepy chest under a heavy quilt. Sometimes it surged above 30%, giving insects the chance to grow into nightmare-fuel dragonflies the size of seagulls. At other times, it sank so low that even breathing at sea level would have felt like hiking up Everest without a Sherpa or a chocolate bar. This ebb and flow was tied to all sorts of planetary quirks. Volcanic eruptions could choke the skies with gases that displaced oxygen. Ice ages could lock away carbon and alter the balance of atmospheric chemistry. Even the slow burial of organic matter in Earth's crust had an effect. Yes, dirt itself was literally hoarding air. The Earth, in short, was temperamental. One day she was serving oxygen like free samples at a grocery store. The next she was snatching it away like an annoyed older sibling. For early humans, this atmosphere was not the invisible comfort blanket it is for us today. It was fickle, unreliable, and sometimes brutally thin. There were periods when oxygen levels dropped low enough that even simple exertion, walking, running, gathering berries, would leave you winded, dizzy, and wondering if maybe that suspiciously green puddle was drinkable after all. But here's the twist. Those conditions shaped us. We evolved not in an oxygen-rich paradise, but in a stingy atmosphere that constantly tested our limits. Our lungs, our blood, our brains, they all developed under the challenge of scarcity. Survival meant adapting to a world where each breath was a reminder that the air didn't particularly care if you lived or died. Think about it the next time you yawn and stretch before bed. You're inhaling the legacy of billions of years of atmospheric drama. Every lungful you take is borrowed from a planet that once made oxygen an exclusive commodity. We are talking proof that somehow, in spite of Earth's moody supply chain, life found a way to breathe. And not just breathe, but thrive. Now that we've set the stage with Earth's fickle air supply, let's step into the sandals, or rather, the bare, calloused feet of early humans. Picture it. You're living on the African savanna nearly 2 million years ago. The sun is rising, your stomach is grumbling because breakfast is usually whatever you can find before something eats you. And you take a deep breath. Except, it doesn't feel deep. The air is thinner than you'd like, and your body knows it. Oxygen levels are lower than today, so every inhale feels a bit unsatisfying, like sipping on a milkshake through one of those useless paper straws. What did low oxygen feel like for early humans? Well, think about how you feel when you run up several flights of stairs. Your chest burns, your head feels light, your legs go wobbly, and for some reason you're convinced this is how you're going to die, despite only carrying 2 grocery bags. That lightheaded, slightly panicked sensation was a more frequent companion for our ancestors. Not constantly our bodies adapt, but enough that life often felt like moving through a world where the volume knob on oxygen was always turned a little too low. The technical term for this sensation is hypoxia. Today, you might experience it if you hike too quickly at high altitude. But for early humans, the world itself was their altitude. They didn't have to climb mountains to experience that fuzzy, breathless state. It was part of everyday life. Imagine needing to sprint away from a saber-toothed cat while your body is simultaneously debating whether you should faint first. That's what I call unfair multitasking. Low oxygen affects the brain first. Early humans probably lived with a constant haze of mental fatigue. Thoughts moved slower, memory wasn't as crisp, and making decisions was harder. This might explain why it took hundreds of thousands of years to figure out how to sharpen rocks properly. Don't laugh, we'd all be bad at innovation if we were essentially walking around half dizzy all the time. It's hard to invent the wheel when you're busy just trying not to collapse. It also meant their bodies had to work harder. Their hearts pumped faster, their lungs expanded more, and their muscles learned to function on less fuel. Imagine waking up every morning already feeling like you'd run a marathon the night before. No wonder naps became a human tradition. Low oxygen life wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. And yet, there's something quietly heroic about it. Despite the constant breathlessness, our ancestors adapted. They developed larger chest cavities to hold bigger lungs, richer blood to transport oxygen more efficiently, and clever strategies to conserve energy. They slowed down when they could, rested often, and learned to spread tasks across the group. Survival was a team sport, partly because no one wanted to faint alone in lion country. Of course, this also shaped their culture. Songs, chants, and early communication might have evolved as much from the rhythm of breath as from the need to share ideas. Even laughter, short bursts of sound between gulps of thin air, might have been nature's way of giving them micro breaks in the struggle for oxygen. I like to think the first human joke wasn't particularly funny, but it was short enough that no one passed out trying to tell it. The reality of breathlessness also made fire even more of a miracle. Not only did it scare away predators and cook food, but gathering around the flames allowed for calmer breathing in sheltered spaces where the air was slightly thicker. Imagine sitting with your group, the stars overhead, the air still thin but a little warmer, the fire crackling, and for once you feel safe enough to sigh deeply, even if the sigh is only half as satisfying as it would be today. So what did low oxygen feel like for early humans? It felt like living in a world where every breath was precious, where running too far might mean blacking out, where thinking too hard could leave you dizzy, and where survival meant mastering the art of doing more with less. It was uncomfortable, frustrating, and sometimes dangerous. And yet, it was also the crucible that forged us into the resilient, adaptable creatures we are today. So the next time you complain about climbing a hill or walking briskly to catch a bus, remember this: your ancestors lived their entire lives in that breathless state. They survived, they thrived, and they passed on their stubborn determination and their big lungs so that you could lie in bed, listening to stories, breathing deeply, and drifting into sleep. Imagine being handed the worst survival kit in history. Instead of rope, food, or a flashlight, you open the box and find a polite little note from the universe. Good luck breathing. That was the early human reality. The atmosphere wasn't generous. Oxygen was stingy, and every breath was like sipping through a straw that had been chewed on by a distracted toddler. Somehow, though, humans didn't just keel over. They adapted. They developed what we might call evolution's emergency toolkit. Except, unlike those glossy, curated survival kits you can buy online, this one was messy, slow, and involved a lot of trial and error. First came the lungs, bigger, broader, deeper. You've probably noticed when looking at old skeletons in museums, or if you've ever stared too long at a diagram in a science textbook, that ancient human chests looked slightly different from ours. Rib cages were wider, barrel-shaped, almost as if they were designed for Olympic-level sighing. This wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a respiratory strategy. Larger chest cavities meant bigger lungs, and bigger lungs meant more air could be dragged in with every breath. Of course, more air didn't always mean more oxygen. It was still thin air, but at least they had a better chance of catching the few molecules floating by. But the lungs couldn't do the heavy lifting alone. Evolution also tinkered with blood. Blood is basically a delivery service Amazon Prime for oxygen, except without the cardboard boxes and questionable ethics. Early humans developed blood that was thicker with red blood cells, more capable of clinging to the scarce oxygen and hustling it to vital organs. Think of it as an upgraded transport fleet. Instead of a couple of scrappy bicycle couriers, they had a whole fleet of vans ready to move oxygen around like VIP packages. The trade-off? Thick blood isn't exactly easy on the plumbing. Hearts had to work harder, which probably meant early humans lived with a constant thudding drumbeat in their chests, as if their bodies were saying, "Keep moving or we're doomed." And then there was the brain. Our ancestors had to cope with oxygen scarcity, not by throwing in the towel, but by making subtle, clever adjustments. Neural activity slowed a little, conserving fuel. It's a bit like dimming the lights in your house during a power outage. You don't get as much sparkle, but you get to keep the fridge running. This may be why progress in toolmaking, firekeeping, and other innovations sometimes moved at the pace of a sleepy snail. But the flip side was that humans learned patience, persistence, and, above all, the art of trial and error. And oh, the errors. Imagine the endless experimentation that went into surviving with so little air. Someone, somewhere, decided maybe running long distances on a near-empty oxygen tank was a good idea. Spoiler, it wasn't. Another human probably thought it was smart to climb a hill in the middle of a drought without resting. They learned the hard way, when dizziness smacked them like a prehistoric hangover. Yet, Each embarrassing tumble and fainting spell taught valuable lessons. Slow down, pace yourself, breathe deliberately. Eventually, entire cultures developed rhythms of life that matched the air's scarcity. Work in short bursts, rest often, share the load. You could almost say humanity's first great innovation was taking strategic naps. Trial and error didn't just apply to movement. Food became part of the oxygen toolkit. 2. Eating iron-rich plants or hunting animals with iron-packed blood helped boost the body's ability to produce those precious oxygen-carrying red blood cells. Early humans probably didn't know the science, but they knew instinctively that some foods gave them the energy to keep going while others just made them sluggish. Over time, diets shaped survival. The best-fed groups thrived, and their children inherited not just the calories but the fine-tuned bodies that could make the most of them. What's funny is that evolution doesn't always hand out neat, elegant solutions. Sometimes it just tosses spaghetti at the wall and sees what sticks. Some human populations ended up with mutations that improved hemoglobin's ability to bind oxygen. Others got slightly more efficient breathing patterns. And some, well, maybe their mutation was just being extra stubborn. Imagine one little band of humans puffing away like asthmatic marathoners, refusing to die simply because they were too busy being stubborn about it. That obstinacy, that refusal to quit despite the odds, became as much a survival tool as the lungs and blood. Over generations, these adaptations compounded. Humans became endurance specialists, creatures uniquely capable of persisting in thin air where others gave up. They weren't the fastest predators or the strongest fighters, but they could outlast almost anything. Give them enough time, and they'd walk, jog, or crawl their prey into exhaustion. This endurance wasn't glamorous, but it was effective. And it was only possible because evolution handed them the emergency toolkit: lungs like bellows, blood like a delivery army, and minds just sharp enough to learn from mistakes instead of repeating them endlessly. So yes, the ancient world was cruelly undersupplied with oxygen, but instead of rolling over and letting extinction win, humans hacked their own biology through trial, error, and a lot of gasping. If you've ever wondered why humans are so good at persistence, why we can walk for days, climb mountains, or run marathons, it's because we are the descendants of people who spent countless generations learning how to squeeze every last drop of life out of the thinnest, stingiest air. If you've ever been unlucky enough to climb a mountain without enough acclimatization, or even just watch someone gasp dramatically in a travel documentary, you know what altitude sickness looks like. Nausea, dizziness, the sudden conviction that sitting down on a rock for the next 3 hours is the best idea anyone's ever had. Well, for ancient humans, that wasn't a vacation problem, it was life. The entire world, in terms of oxygen supply, felt like one long camping trip on Mount Everest. Except there were no tents, no hot cocoa, and definitely no helicopter rescues. The comparison isn't an exaggeration. Oxygen levels in parts of the prehistoric world were so low that even at what we consider sea level, humans felt like they were thousands of meters higher. Every step was a negotiation with thin air. You could survive, but you were always just a little bit out of breath, like you'd been running, even when all you did was bend over to tie your sandals, which, let's be honest, were probably just strips of leather that broke every third day. Imagine waking up in the morning and realizing that your daily walk to gather food felt like trekking base camp to base camp. No oxygen bars, no Sherpas, just your family, your tired lungs, and the vague hope you wouldn't collapse in front of everyone while holding a handful of roots. The world was relentless in its demand that you work harder for every breath. Of course, humans got used to it. The body has an amazing ability to acclimatize. Spend long enough at altitude, and your blood thickens, your lungs expand, and suddenly the mountain doesn't feel so deadly. For early humans, there was no acclimatization trip because they never left the altitude. They were born into it, raised in it, and buried in it. This constant pressure shaped their bodies, their lifestyles, even their psychology. Being breathless wasn't a temporary inconvenience. It was the normal soundtrack of existence. Now, think about Everest climbers today. They take tiny, deliberate steps, conserving oxygen, focusing on one slow-motion movement at a time. Early humans lived in that rhythm. Every task was slower, more measured. You didn't sprint to gather berries. You plodded. You didn't dash after prey. You shadowed it, patiently, until the animal dropped from exhaustion long before you did. Living at altitude everywhere turned humans into experts at patience, persistence, and energy management. It also made the environment itself feel larger, more intimidating. With thin air pressing on their lungs, humans had to treat every landscape like a potential Everest. Hills weren't just hills. They were grueling slogs. Rivers weren't just rivers. Crossing them while breathless could feel like a triathlon event. This created a culture of respect, borderline fear toward the natural world. Every journey demanded careful planning. Every migration required strategies to keep people from literally keeling over halfway. And yet, there was resilience in this constant challenge. It forged communities that relied on cooperation. Nobody was sprinting ahead, leaving others behind. Groups moved together, rested together, breathed together. In a way, the entire species learned to synchronize with its own limited oxygen supply. This wasn't just biology, it was social glue. Humans who lived in an Everest-like world everywhere had to develop patience with each other, compassion for the slower, weaker members. After all, when everyone's lungs are underperforming, teamwork becomes the difference between survival and extinction. And here's the strange irony. This breathless existence also gave humans an edge. Other species, bigger, stronger predators, struggled more when oxygen levels dipped. They burned fuel faster, needed more air to power their bulky bodies. Humans, with their slow, steady, oxygen-efficient approach, often outlasted them. The very atmosphere that made life so exhausting also helped tilt the balance of survival in our favor. If you fast forward to today, you can still see echoes of this high-altitude world in certain populations. The Sherpa people of Nepal, the Quechua of the Andes, the Amhara of Ethiopia, all descendants of humans who became absolute masters of life in thin air. Their bodies are tuned to oxygen scarcity in ways that seem almost superhuman to the rest of us. But in truth, they're simply carrying forward a skill that was once universal. For most of human history, everyone was basically living the Sherpa life, climbing their personal Everest every single day, just to fetch water, gather food, and walk home again. So the ancient world was Everest, without the bragging rights, without the summit selfies. Every human was a mountaineer, not by choice but by necessity. They didn't conquer the mountain, they were the mountain, enduring its challenges in every breath. It was exhausting, yes, but it also shaped us into the resilient, stubborn, cooperative species we are today. We learned not just to survive in thin air, but to thrive, turning the entire planet into our high-altitude training ground. Imagine stepping into a cave on a winter evening, nearly 1 million years ago. It's dark, colder than you hoped, and the air feels like it's been sitting there since the dawn of time, stale, heavy, and unfriendly. You huddle with your clan, bones creaking, stomach growling, and lungs still not thrilled about this whole low-oxygen atmosphere Earth insists on providing. Then, someone, maybe by accident, maybe through stubborn trial and error, manages to coax sparks into flame. Suddenly, the cave is not just a hole in the rock. It's alive. Light dances across the walls. Shadows leap like jittery spirits. And for the first time, the world feels less hostile. But along with warmth and light, fire also brought something less obvious. A whole new way of messing with oxygen. Because here's the thing. Fire doesn't run on magic. It runs on oxygen. Every flicker, every crackle, is actually oxygen molecules throwing themselves onto the pyre like tiny volunteers at the ultimate barbecue. When early humans discovered fire, they didn't just unlock a tool for cooking and survival. They discovered a rival. Suddenly, they had a housemate that also breathed oxygen, except it did so noisily, hungrily, and with zero manners. Picture a group of ancient humans huddled in a cave, fire blazing merrily in the center. They lean closer, grateful for the warmth, for the way it pushes back the cold and the long shadows of the night. They breathe easier not because the air is richer, but because they feel safer. Yet, while they're sighing in relief, the fire is sucking up their oxygen like an uninvited cousin at a family dinner polishing off all the dessert. Fire made life better in so many ways, but it also introduced the constant danger of suffocation. Of course, they didn't know the chemistry. Nobody stood up and said, "Wait a second, everyone. This combustion process is depleting our O2 levels while producing CO2 at an alarming rate." They just noticed that if the cave was too small and the fire too large, people started to feel woozy. Someone might faint or wake up with a pounding headache, and the clan would mutter about bad spirits or cranky gods, when in reality it was just carbon monoxide, quietly plotting its evil work. The fire, that beautiful glowing miracle, could be friend or foe, depending on how it was handled. And so, humanity learned to experiment. Too much fire in too small a cave? Disaster. Too little fire in too large a space? Everyone shivered. Over countless nights, they figured out balance, small, controlled flames that offered heat and light without devouring all the breathable air. This was more than comfort. It was survival. Managing fire was a prehistoric version of HVAC engineering, complete with natural ventilation hacks like cave entrances, cracks in the rock, or holes dug to let smoke escape. It was an art form. Early humans became oxygen accountants, learning to budget the invisible resource that both they and the fire depended on. But fire didn't just consume oxygen. It also created opportunities. A burning flame could alter airflow inside caves. Heat rises, drawing in cooler air from outside. This simple convection meant that fires sometimes improved ventilation, pulling in fresh oxygen while pushing smoke out. To a modern mind, this might sound like science, but to ancient people it probably looked like magic. The cave literally breathing with them, sighing fresh air whenever flames crackled brightly. No wonder fire quickly became wrapped in myth, treated with reverence and fear. It wasn't just light. It was life itself, reshaping the invisible air they struggled to breathe. Fire also changed where humans lived. Before flames, caves were dangerous holes, filled with predators and damp gloom. After fire, caves became homes. The light scared away animals, the heat kept people alive through cold nights, and the smoke, though suffocating if uncontrolled, sometimes even drove away insects. But each of these benefits came at the cost of careful oxygen management. Staying too deep inside a cave without ventilation was a recipe for unconsciousness. Families would wake up sluggish, dizzy, their survival jeopardized not by lions outside, but by invisible gases inside. Those who learned to keep flames small and find caves with good air circulation survived. Those who didn't probably gave us the first ghost stories. Cooking food over fire also shifted oxygen dynamics. Raw diets required more chewing and energy, but cooking softened roots and meats, making them easier to digest. That freed up energy, and energy meant better oxygen efficiency inside the body. Humans weren't just breathing air, they were breathing smarter calories. Fire became part of the oxygen equation, indirectly helping lungs and blood by reducing the workload of digestion. Think of it as an early version of a nutritional hack. Want to breathe easier? Try roasted tubers, now with 50% less jaw effort. And fire had one more trick up its sleeve. It encouraged humans to gather, to sit close together, sharing warmth and stories. These gatherings may have extended the day, allowing people to plan, to communicate, to sing. And singing, though it used precious oxygen, probably improved lung strength, turning breathing itself into a kind of training. Around the fire, humans not only stayed alive, they practiced endurance without even knowing it. The cave filled with smoke, with laughter, with coughing, with songs. Fire taught them how to breathe, as individuals and as a group, always adjusting to the invisible dance between flame and air. So, the fire factor wasn't just about warmth and roasted mammoth steaks. It was about oxygen, how to balance it, how to protect it, and how to live in partnership with a greedy but miraculous new element of survival. Fire consumed it, reshuffled it, sometimes choked it, sometimes refreshed it. In every crackle and glow, humanity was learning the invisible science of air, long before anyone could name it. The lesson was simple: share your oxygen wisely, because your survival depends on it. If oxygen is the currency of survival, then food is the sneaky little bank that lends you extra credit. Ancient humans, struggling in a world of thin air, didn't know about hemoglobin or metabolism, but they knew this. Some foods made them stronger, while others left them wheezing like broken accordions. Their diets became a second oxygen toolkit, turning meals into breath management systems. It wasn't just about filling the belly, it was about fueling the body in ways that made every lungful count. Iron was the hidden star of this prehistoric menu. Iron is the magic ingredient in hemoglobin, the protein that lets blood carry oxygen. Without iron, your blood cells are like taxis with no seats, plenty of cars, but nobody can ride. Early humans figured this out not with lab tests, but with life or death observation. Groups that ate iron-rich foods like organ meats, marrow, and certain plants had more stamina. They could walk farther, run longer, and recover quicker. People who missed out looked pale, sluggish, and often didn't keep up. Over generations, humans who instinctively sought out iron-rich diets passed on that survival instinct, which is why so many of us still crave red meat today. It isn't just indulgence, it's a whisper from our oxygen-starved ancestors. But diets weren't all glamorous steaks and marrow feasts. Strange strategies developed. People gnawed on roots bitter enough to make modern taste testers cry. They chewed bark, sucked minerals from bones, and licked rocks for salt. Yes, literally, licked rocks. Salt helped balance fluids, which in turn made blood more efficient at moving oxygen. Imagine a whole clan crouched around a salt deposit, happily licking the ground like it was the world's saddest ice cream cone. Strange, yes, but effective. Plants offered their own odd help. Certain leaves and seeds contained compounds that thinned blood slightly, helping it flow faster through oxygen-hungry tissues. Others acted as stimulants, perking up tired minds with bursts of chemical energy. The ancestors of caffeine plants may have provided tiny boosts, giving hunters sharper focus, even when the air left them lightheaded. Picture an early human chewing bitter leaves before a hunt, jittery but alert, basically inventing the first energy drink minus the neon-colored can. Then there was fat. Modern people fear it, but in the oxygen-scarce ancient world, fat was gold. Dense calories packed into every mouthful meant more energy for less effort. Fat fed the brain, which was already expensive in oxygen terms, and fueled muscles during long hunts. A fat-rich diet was like carrying a spare battery when your body's oxygen power supply was unreliable. Groups who mastered hunting large animals, mammoths, bison, seals, gained access not just to protein but to fat, and with it, the ability to breathe easier through better metabolic efficiency. Of course, not every dietary experiment was a success. Some plants were toxic. Some roots caused more stomach pain than energy. Trial and error meant that someone, somewhere, was always the guinea pig. You can almost hear the conversations. Try this root, Og. If you die, we won't eat it again. Harsh, but practical. Over generations, these experiments built up vast knowledge systems. What could be eaten safely? What could help breathing? What could kill? Food wasn't just sustenance. It was information, memorized and passed down through stories, rituals, and taboos. Fire played its part here too. Cooking food made nutrients more available, especially carbohydrates in tubers and grains. Cooked starches became easy-to-digest sugars that gave quick bursts of energy perfect for oxygen-deprived bodies. Cooking also neutralized toxins, turning previously dangerous plants into safe staples. With every meal, humans hacked their metabolism, trading raw survival for something more sustainable. What's fascinating is how these ancient diets echo in our bodies today. Populations living at altitude, the Andes, the Himalayas, Ethiopia still rely on iron-rich foods, fatty staples, and plants that boost circulation. Coca leaves in the Andes, for instance, help highland dwellers manage oxygen scarcity even now. These aren't quirks of culture, they're living fossils of prehistoric strategies. Food was never just food in the thin-aired ancient world. It was medicine, oxygen management, survival insurance. Eating marrow from cracked bones, gnawing bitter roots, savoring rich fats, all of it was part of breathing strategy. Our ancestors may not have had scientific terms for it, but they lived the experiment daily. They learned that what you eat can make every breath easier or harder, and in a world where oxygen itself was stingy, that knowledge was as vital as fire or shelter. So, the next time you take a deep, satisfying breath after a good meal, remember, you're reenacting a prehistoric ritual. Your body is using food to fuel oxygen, just as your ancestors did when they chewed roots, cracked bones, and licked rocks. Strange diets, yes. But without them, none of us would be here breathing at all. Imagine waking up in the prehistoric world. The first thing you notice isn't the warm sun or the sound of birds. It's that your body already feels like it's halfway through the day, as if you'd run a marathon in your sleep. Your arms are heavy, your legs feel sluggish, and even your brain is moving at half speed, grinding away like a rusty old millstone. That's because in a world with low oxygen, metabolism, the grand energy-making machine inside every one of us, didn't run on overdrive. It ran like a sleepy donkey pulling a cart. Slow, reluctant, determined maybe, but not in any kind of hurry. Oxygen is the secret ingredient of metabolism. It's the spark plug that lets us burn food for energy. Without enough of it, that whole system sputters. It's like trying to cook a feast with a candle instead of a roaring stove. You'll get something, but don't expect a banquet. Early humans had to live with this reality. Their bodies processed food more slowly, their muscles recovered sluggishly, and their brains, those greedy oxygen hogs, often ran on half-charged batteries. Life itself moved at a different pace. Picture an early human deciding to get up in the morning. We like to imagine them springing into action, ready to hunt mammoths or gather berries. But more likely, they rolled out of bed or whatever pile of furs and sticks passed as a bed and sat there for a long time, just breathing, waiting for their blood to catch up. The morning grogginess you and I feel today? Multiply that by 10. They weren't lazy. They were literally waiting for chemistry to get its act together. Everything in their world took longer. Walking long distances wasn't a brisk march. It was a steady plod. Running wasn't a quick dash. It was a series of short bursts, with lots of catching your breath breaks in between. Even speech may have carried the rhythm of low oxygen. Slower sentences, longer pauses, words spaced out with deliberate breathing. It wasn't just culture that was slow. Biology demanded it. And let's not forget digestion. Metabolism slowed that down too. Eating in the low-oxygen world wasn't about scarfing down food and instantly feeling a burst of energy. It was about eating, waiting, digesting, and gradually absorbing what little your body could coax into fuel. Meals lingered. Fullness lasted longer, not because the food was luxurious, but because your stomach was working at the pace of a snail crossing a wet log. This slower metabolism also meant that calories were precious. Bodies learned to conserve energy, to store fat, to use fuel, with miserly efficiency. Every cell was like a tiny accountant, carefully weighing expenses against resources. This is why humans became so good at surviving famines. We evolved under conditions where energy wasn't something you splurged, it was something you rationed, one slow, burning ember at a time. But this sluggishness wasn't all doom and gloom. In some ways, it shaped human strengths. Low oxygen encouraged patience. You can't rush across the savannah when your body's chemistry won't allow it. Instead, you walk steadily. You observe. You learn to outlast. Humans became persistence hunters, not because we were the fastest predators, but because we were the most stubborn. Slow metabolism trained us to value endurance over speed, strategy over brute force. Still, imagine the frustration. You want to climb a hill to gather fruit, but halfway up, your thighs are burning and your lungs are screaming for more air. You sit down, wait 10 minutes, then try again. Daily chores became miniature epics. Fetching water, carrying wood, chasing prey, each task stretched out into long sagas of exertion and rest. If ancient life were a movie, it wouldn't play at normal speed. It would be in slow motion, every movement accompanied by heavy breathing and frequent breaks. Even social life was affected. Conversation around the fire wasn't fast-paced banter. It was deliberate, unhurried, broken up by pauses to catch breath. Songs were likely slow chants, rhythm matching the collective pace of lungs, struggling to keep up. Stories may have unfolded like gentle waves, long stretches of quiet, followed by bursts of speech. The tempo of life itself, from work to play to storytelling, was tuned to the breathless rhythm of low oxygen. What's remarkable is how humans adapted emotionally to this pace. Instead of raging against the slowness, they folded it into culture. Rest was not laziness, it was survival. Silence was not awkward, it was necessary. Slowness became the natural state of being. People lived in a world where patience wasn't a virtue, it was the only way forward. So, in the grand theatre of evolution, low oxygen forced humanity to slow down, to live deliberately, to conserve, to endure. We learned to thrive not in sprints, but in steady plods. Life was measured in breaths, each one precious, each one rationed like a treasure. The pace of early human life was not the frantic rush of modern times, but a quiet, careful, oxygen-scarce dance with the atmosphere itself. If you've ever stood up too fast and felt the room tilt, you've had a tiny taste of what daily life was like for early humans in the thin-aired ancient world. That woozy, knees-buckling, vision-tunneling moment? For them, it wasn't a rare accident. It was practically a lifestyle. Low oxygen didn't just slow metabolism, it played endless pranks on the body, turning ordinary movement into a clumsy ballet. Picture a group of humans walking across the savannah. The ground is flat, the sun is bright, and everything seems fine. Then suddenly, one of them stumbles over nothing, arms flailing like a scarecrow caught in the wind. He's not drunk. He hasn't been into the fermented fruit stash. He's just lightheaded. His brain, starved of oxygen, briefly decided to take a nap while his body was still standing. The result? A prehistoric pratfall worthy of slapstick comedy. And this wasn't rare. Hypoxia, the fancy word for low oxygen, makes people dizzy, uncoordinated, and prone to fainting. Early humans were constantly at risk of collapsing mid-task. Imagine chasing a rabbit, only to keel over like a puppet whose strings got cut. Imagine trying to impress someone with your spear-throwing skills, and instead passing out halfway through the motion. Survival wasn't just about hunting or gathering. It was about staying upright long enough to do either. From the outside, it must have looked a little funny. Groups of people weaving across the plains, like tipsy wanderers, wobbling as if the earth itself was shifting beneath their feet. But for them, it was deadly serious. One wrong stumble near a cliff, a fainting spell during a predator encounter, and the comedy routine had a tragic ending. Evolution was ruthless about who could manage their clumsiness and who couldn't. Those who learned to pace themselves, to sit down before blacking out, to laugh it off and keep moving, lived to pass on their genes. It's not hard to imagine laughter itself becoming part of the coping mechanism. Someone falls, everyone laughs, and in that laughter is both relief and bonding. You're alive, you just fainted. Haha, now get back up. Humor might have been born in those very moments, a way to soften the sharp edge of constant oxygen, starved blunders. Clumsiness wasn't just tolerated, it was woven into the rhythm of community life. Even simple tasks could become comedic episodes. Carrying water back from a stream? Watch someone wobble like a circus performer trying to balance on a rope. Gathering fruit from trees? Half the group fainted after climbing 2 branches. Dancing, if they dared to do it, must have been a hilarious slow-motion shuffle punctuated by sudden collapses. Human clumsiness, honed in these oxygen-poor conditions, may explain why even today we trip over flat ground, bump into door frames, and fumble with car keys. It's genetic memory, a lingering echo of a time when gravity and dizziness teamed up against us. But the comedy wasn't just physical. Mental clumsiness was part of the package. Hypoxia makes thought slippery, concentration weak. Early humans probably had conversations that went something like this. Hand me the thing with the sharp, the spear? Yes, the spear. That's what I said. It's not hard to see how patience, repetition, and nonverbal communication became essential survival skills. When half the group's brains were foggy, pointing and grunting was safer than long, eloquent speeches. And yet, despite the constant dizziness and fainting, humanity endured. We didn't vanish in a haze of pratfalls. We adapted, laughed, and stumbled forward literally. In fact, clumsiness may have helped us. Slower, more careful movements reduced accidents. Frequent pauses to recover breathing gave time for observation, for planning. And the humor that grew around these awkward moments forged bonds that kept groups cohesive. So, yes, early humans often looked tipsy. They fainted, stumbled, and wobbled their way through a world with stingy oxygen. It wasn't graceful, it wasn't glamorous, but it was real. And out of that clumsy dance came resilience, humor, and the strange ability to fall, get up, and keep going. In a sense, every trip and tumble was practice for survival. Every feint was a lesson. Every wobble was another step forward in the long, staggering march of humanity. Close your eyes and imagine stepping into the ancient world, a landscape filled with tall grasses swaying like an ocean under the wind, strange trees casting long shadows, and somewhere, always somewhere, the sound of predators moving just beyond sight. Now, in your lungs, the air feels thin, stingy. You take a breath, but it doesn't fill you. You feel a little woozy, a little slow. That's your daily reality as an early human. And unfortunately, you are not the only creature living in this environment. Every other animal is dealing with the same oxygen-starved air, but some of them, annoyingly enough, are doing just fine. The predators, the great cats, the wolves, the packs of hyenas, they didn't seem nearly as bothered about gasping for breath as humans did. Predators thrived while humans wheezed, and that made survival a daily comedy horror show. Picture a lioness crouched in the grass, muscles coiled like springs, eyes glinting with perfect focus. She leaps with elegance and terrifying speed, landing squarely on her prey. Meanwhile, the humans nearby are trying to jog away, but they're out of breath after 20 steps, panting like broken bellows. It's not exactly a fair fight. If nature were a sporting event, the predators were Olympic sprinters and gymnasts rolled into one, while humans were the clumsy kids excused from gym class for asthma. But humans had a strange kind of advantage hidden inside their disadvantage. While predators could sprint and leap, they couldn't always go the distance. Cats and wolves needed bursts of energy. They were efficient killers in seconds, but if a hunt dragged on, their oxygen needs caught up with them, their bodies overheated, their muscles fatigued, and their oxygen tanks sputtered out. Humans, even though they wheezed and stumbled, were masters of persistence. We didn't have claws, we didn't have fangs, and we definitely didn't have speed. What we had was endurance. Our ancestors figured out, through necessity, that if you could stay alive long enough, the mighty predator might give up before you did. That didn't mean predators weren't terrifying. They were. Nighttime especially was a parade of teeth and claws. Imagine sitting around a small fire, the light flickering against the cave wall, and hearing the bone-chilling laughter of hyenas echoing across the dark, or the sudden roar of a big cat carrying through the still air. Early humans weren't just managing oxygen, they were managing fear. And fear has a way of stealing your breath too. Imagine already gasping from thin air, then piling panic on top of it. Every hunt, every trip to gather water, every night in the open was a gamble. And yet, not every animal was a foe. Some, oddly enough, became allies, though not in the Disney sense of a cheerful lion cub or a singing bird. Birds, actually, were allies of a different kind. The alarm calls of certain species alerted humans to danger before their slow brains and lungs caught on. You'd be plodding along, half dizzy, when, suddenly the chatter of birds around you shifted. That was your cue. Something with teeth was nearby. Pay attention, or you'd be lunch. Dogs, of course, came into the story later. Wolves that had once been predators became companions, their superior senses and stamina folded into human survival. Imagine being an oxygen-starved human with a wolf-like ally at your side, warning you of danger and helping you hunt. That was one of the great turning points. Taking a foe and transforming it into family. But until then, the balance was tipped in the predator's favor. The air wasn't just a challenge for humans, it shaped the entire predator-prey dynamic. With low oxygen, every hunt, every chase was shorter, more intense. For predators, this meant they needed to perfect the ambush, the quick kill. For humans, it meant they had to become paranoid planners, always watching the wind, the grass, the shadows. They couldn't afford mistakes. A stumble in thin air wasn't just embarrassing, it was fatal. But here's the strange thing. Predators, while thriving in the moment, didn't evolve the same long-term hacks that humans did. Their bursts of glory couldn't keep up with the slow grind of environmental change. Humans, though comical in their breathlessness, kept learning, kept adapting, and eventually outlasted many of their fiercest rivals. The saber-toothed cats, the giant hyenas, the terrifying short-faced bears, they all had their day. But humans, awkward, oxygen-starved, endlessly stumbling humans, survived to tell the story. So in the end, predators may have thrived while humans wheezed. But wheezing had its own hidden strength. It forced patience, it forced cooperation, and it forced innovation. The predators got the glory of speed, but humans, stumbling along, got the last laugh. When life hands you thin air, you don't exactly get to return it for store credit. You adapt, or you die. That's the harsh math of evolution. For humans living in the oxygen-poor world of prehistory, the solution wasn't immediate. It took thousands upon thousands of years of gradual adjustments, little tweaks to the body, that eventually added up to survival. These were the first oxygen hacks, written not in journals or blogs, but in genes. One of the most obvious changes was in the chest. Skeletons of ancient humans show wider rib cages, broader torsos, barrel-shaped bodies that could house larger lungs. Bigger lungs meant more air could be drawn in, even if the air itself wasn't generous with oxygen. You could say evolution handed them built-in bellows. Not stylish, perhaps, but effective. Imagine a population of humans where the best breathers lived longer and had more children. Slowly, generation by generation, the average lung capacity expanded. Blood was another area of innovation. Hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen, became more efficient in many populations. Some people developed thicker blood, loaded with red blood cells, giving them a better chance of feeding their oxygen-hungry brains and muscles. The trade-off was higher strain on the heart. But in the brutal calculus of survival, that was worth it. Better to have a pounding heart than a brain starved of air. Then there was body size. Smaller bodies require less oxygen, and in some environments, smaller-framed humans thrived better than bulky ones. At the same time, leaner muscles that burned fuel slowly were more efficient than massive ones, demanding constant replenishment. Evolution nudged the balance toward bodies that could do more with less. There were also less visible hacks. At the cellular level, mitochondria, the tiny engines of our cells, became more efficient in some lineages. They learned to squeeze energy out of every oxygen molecule, like thrifty chefs making gourmet meals out of scraps. These microscopic shifts meant survival, even if nobody knew it was happening. But not all hacks were genetic. Some were behavioral, learned, and passed down. Humans discovered that resting frequently, pacing themselves, and working in groups reduced the burden on any single body. They learned to breathe rhythmically during long tasks, a primitive form of breathwork that modern athletes still use. Over time, these behaviors became cultural habits, merging with genetic adaptations to create a multi-layered survival strategy. It's important to remember that these changes didn't happen smoothly. Evolution is trial and error. Some groups developed adaptations that worked beautifully. Others, less lucky, dwindled and disappeared. Those who survived passed on their successful hacks. Over time, these became the blueprint for modern humanity. Today, you can still see echoes of this long adaptation in populations who live at high altitude. People in the Andes, Tibet, and the Ethiopian highlands each solved the oxygen puzzle in different ways. Some developed higher hemoglobin levels, Others evolved faster breathing rates or blood vessels that deliver oxygen more efficiently. These aren't modern quirks. They're the continuation of ancient hacks, still being refined by evolution even now. And perhaps the greatest hack of all was stubbornness. The human body didn't evolve to be perfect at anything. It evolved to be good enough to keep going. We don't run the fastest, we don't climb the highest, we don't breathe the deepest. But our combination of adaptations, bigger lungs, stronger blood, efficient cells, careful pacing, made us capable of enduring what would have broken many other species. We are not elegant machines. We are patched together survivors. So when you breathe deeply tonight, filling your chest and feeling the oxygen slide into your blood, remember, you're using tools that were forged slowly, painfully, over countless generations. You are the product of genetic tweaks and behavioral hacks that turned breathless, stumbling ancestors into resilient humans. Your very inhale is an ancient victory. When you lie down tonight, adjusting your pillow just so, perhaps pulling the blanket over your shoulders, you don't think much about the air. You inhale, you exhale, and it's steady, soothing, automatic. But for ancient humans living in an oxygen-thin world, sleep was not so straightforward. Rest was a nightly negotiation with the atmosphere, a delicate truce between lungs that wanted more oxygen and a planet that couldn't be bothered to provide it. Imagine settling down to sleep while feeling a little like you're camped halfway up Mount Everest every single night, except instead of a luxury down sleeping bag and hot tea, you have scratchy animal hides and the sound of predators echoing outside. Cozy, right? The human body needs sleep to survive, but sleep itself makes you vulnerable. Your breathing slows, your awareness drops, and in low oxygen conditions, that's a dangerous cocktail. If you've ever woken up suddenly at high altitude, gasping like you've been yanked out of a dream into thin air, then you've tasted the challenge of ancient rest. Early humans lived with that nightly. Sleep wasn't just about closing your eyes. It was about creating strategies, both biological and cultural, to keep breathing when the body threatened to forget. Biologically, sleep in low oxygen forced the body into odd adaptations. The breathing patterns of early humans would have been shallow, restless, fragmented. They likely snored more, not because they were particularly relaxed, but because their bodies were fighting to keep air moving. Periods of apnea moments where breathing pauses may have been common, each one a tiny alarm bell in the night. But through generations, evolution adjusted. People who naturally had steadier breathing, who could maintain oxygen levels through the night without waking every 10 minutes, survived and passed on that ability. Slowly, humanity developed into a species that could endure sleep in oxygen-starved caves and shelters. But biology wasn't enough. Ancient humans had to invent cultural hacks for sleep, long before memory foam mattresses were even a dream. One strategy was sleeping together, literally piling close to share warmth and regulate breathing. When bodies huddled, heat from the group stabilized the microclimate. Warmer air held slightly more movement and circulation, reducing the suffocating stillness of a cold cave. Children slept between adults, the most vulnerable protected by the breathing rhythm of the stronger. It was part protection, part ventilation, and part prehistoric cuddle pile. If you've ever had too many people crash on your couch after a party, imagine that but for survival. Fire changed the sleep equation too. A carefully managed fire not only kept predators at bay, but altered the airflow of a shelter. The flicker of flame drew in cooler air, circulating oxygen, and reducing the feeling of stagnation. Of course, the danger of smoke made this tricky. Too much fire, and instead of dozing, you'd wake up coughing like you'd spent the night chain smoking. Too little, and you'd shiver. The art of tending a fire for sleep was like learning to operate a very fussy natural air conditioner, with the added bonus that if you failed, everyone might suffocate. And then there were positions. Modern people toss and turn looking for comfort. Ancient humans might have done the same, but their choices were limited. Certain positions helped breathing. Sitting partially upright against a cave wall, for instance, kept airways clearer. Side sleeping, which reduced the chance of choking or collapsing air passages, may have been the default long before anyone invented ergonomic pillows. Even today, doctors recommend side sleeping for people with breathing issues. That's not modern wisdom, it's ancient trial and error, echoing through time. Sleep schedules were different too. In low oxygen, long uninterrupted sleep was harder. Instead of 8 solid hours, early humans may have slept in segments, shorter bursts of rest, broken by periods of wakefulness. This wasn't laziness, it was survival. Wake for an hour, stoke the fire, check the air, listen for predators, then drift back to sleep. These segmented nights gave the lungs a chance to reset and the group a chance to stay alert. Strangely enough, studies of pre-industrial societies suggest this two sleeps pattern may have been normal for most of human history. It wasn't until the modern era, with stable air and electric lights, that we started expecting one long block of rest. Dreams in this world must have been odd. Oxygen deprivation plays tricks on the brain, creating vivid, surreal images. Early humans may have drifted into strange visions, their minds mixing survival anxieties with bizarre shapes and colors. Shamans, storytellers, and mythmakers may have drawn inspiration from these oxygen-starved dreams, spinning them into rituals and beliefs. The line between breathing struggles and spiritual encounters was probably very thin. When you wake up gasping in the middle of the night, it feels like a spirit sat on your chest. In prehistoric times, that sensation may have been explained, not by medicine, but by myth. Despite the risks, sleep strategies worked. Slowly, humans mastered the art of resting in thin air. They slept in groups, they used fire, they learned positions and patterns, they shared warmth and rhythm. Each adjustment was a step toward making the impossible possible. Sleeping deeply, when the atmosphere itself seemed determined to keep you awake. Tonight, as you lie down in comfort, remember that every deep sigh of relaxation is the inheritance of people who fought for their nightly rest with every breath they had. The history of humanity is often told as a tale of genius, brilliant minds inventing tools, discovering fire, taming the world with foresight and skill. But if you zoom in a little closer, you'll see a different truth. Much of our survival was built not on brilliance but on happy accidents, the kind of blunders that, by sheer luck, ended up saving lives. We stumbled, literally and figuratively, into methods that stuck. The prehistoric world was less a laboratory of scientists in white coats and more a clumsy experiment where failure was common, and success often looked like pure coincidence. Take fire, for example. The first discovery of fire wasn't a carefully planned event. It was almost certainly a case of some lightning striking a tree, or volcanic activity spitting flames, or two rocks smashing together at just the right angle. Humans didn't invent fire, they tripped over it. But what mattered is that someone was curious enough not to run away screaming. Instead, they approached cautiously and learned that this terrifying, beautiful thing could also be useful. That curiosity, mixed with accident, became the foundation of one of the most important survival tools ever. The same goes for tools. Early humans may have set out to crack nuts or bones, only to notice that broken rocks made sharp edges. Suddenly, an accident turned into innovation. Those sharp edges became knives, scrapers, weapons. Someone cut their hand by mistake, cursed in whatever language they used at the time, and then realized the cut edge could cut meat too. Tools weren't invented through eureka moments. They were noticed through clumsy mistakes. Even clothing was likely accidental at first. Imagine someone draping an animal hide over their shoulders simply because they were too tired to drag it home. Then, surprise, it kept them warm. Suddenly, a practical accident became a fashion trend that stuck for the next 100,000 years. If you've ever worn something because it was nearby rather than stylish, congratulations, you're keeping up the oldest human tradition. Food innovations followed the same chaotic pattern. Someone dropped meat into a fire and panicked about ruining dinner, only to discover it tasted better cooked. Someone soaked bitter roots in water to soften them and realized the toxins leached out. Someone forgot a pile of fruit and found it had fermented into something fizzy that made them giggle. Accidental cuisine became cultural tradition. Trial and error, seasoned heavily with luck, built the human menu. Accidents also shaped shelter. Caves were probably discovered not as deliberate homes, but as hiding spots from storms or predators. Once inside, people realized these rocky hollows offered insulation, darkness, and safety. Over time, accidents became architecture. Branches stacked haphazardly in a storm might collapse into a crude hut, inspiring someone to copy the design on purpose. Humanity's earliest architects were clumsy builders, whose mistakes didn't kill them. Even medicine has its roots in accidents. Someone chewed bark to soothe hunger, and found their headache disappeared. Someone noticed that a poultice of certain leaves healed wounds faster. Someone ate the wrong mushroom and had visions, leading others to decide it must have power. Half the discoveries were disastrous, but the survivors carried lessons forward. Accidents became traditions because humans are storytellers. One person's blunder, if it led to survival, was remembered, retold, copied. Soon, the community treated the lucky mistake as sacred knowledge. Do it this way, they'd say, not because they understood the science, but because someone once got it right by chance. Over time, those accidents built the scaffolding of culture. This stumbling forward pattern still defines us. Even today, some of our greatest innovations are accidents. Penicillin discovered from mold in a dish. Microwaves from a melted chocolate bar in a scientist's pocket. Humanity thrives not because we avoid mistakes, but because we learn from them. We trip, we fall, we laugh, we adapt. So when you look back at early humans bumbling through their oxygen-starved world, remember that their survival wasn't polished genius. It was clumsy persistence. Accidents noticed and repeated until they became innovation. They stumbled into the future, and somehow, so do we. If you've ever noticed how you sigh more deeply when you're sitting with friends, or how a room feels calmer when everyone breathes together, you're touching on something that goes back far, far into human history. For early humans, living in a world where oxygen was thin and energy came at a premium, survival wasn't just about the lungs in your chest. It was about the lungs of the whole group. One person's breath mattered, but the rhythm of the community mattered more. Breathing, after all, is both individual and shared. You inhale for yourself, but the air you exhale fills the same small cave or shelter where everyone else is inhaling too. In the thin-aired prehistoric world, this wasn't an abstract thought. It was immediate, tangible. Too many people too close to the fire, and suddenly the oxygen dropped and the group gasped together. Too much smoke without ventilation, and everyone coughed in chorus. You can imagine those early moments where survival was less about individual heroics and more about coordinating, even if clumsily, as a collective lung. Cooperation was born in this atmosphere of scarcity. If your body is struggling to fuel itself, you quickly learn that you can't do everything alone. Gathering food, keeping watch for predators, tending the fire, these were all jobs that required energy. And energy was in short supply. The solution was to divide the labor. While one group rested, another kept guard. While the strongest went to fetch water, the others conserved energy by staying put. Even breathing together became a kind of shared ritual, a synchronization of rhythm that gave comfort and stability. Imagine a group of 20 people in a cave at night, lying close together for warmth. The air is thin, fire crackles in the middle, and outside, the wind howls. Slowly, one person begins to snore, another sighs, and eventually, the whole group falls into a rhythm. It's not perfect. It's filled with coughs and wheezes, but it's synchronized enough to feel like safety. That shared breath wasn't just oxygen exchange, it was community. It reminded each person that they weren't alone in their struggle against the suffocating air. From this foundation, the larger structures of cooperation began to grow. Sharing food was the most obvious next step. If one hunter had a lucky day and another came back empty-handed, the group divided the catch. This wasn't generosity in the modern sense. It was survival insurance. Everyone knew that someday their luck would flip. Oxygen scarcity and low energy meant no one could afford to let group members starve. The cost of losing even one pair of lungs and hands was too high. Better to share the meat and keep the group whole than to risk weakening the community. Cooperation extended beyond food. Knowledge itself became communal property. If one person figured out that a certain root gave energy instead of stomach cramps, that knowledge spread, saving others from repeating painful mistakes. If one family learned to build shelters in a way that let air circulate better, the method spread to neighboring groups. Breath was scarce, energy was scarce, and hoarding information was as dangerous as hoarding food. The origins of teaching, storytelling, and cultural memory grew out of these shared survival strategies. And humor, oddly enough, was part of it too. When you're gasping for air, when the whole group is stumbling around half dizzy, laughter becomes a pressure valve. Someone trips, someone faints dramatically, someone snores like a wild animal, and the group laughs. That laughter isn't just entertainment. It's bonding. It's shared rhythm. It's social breathwork. Every chuckle is an exhale that syncs the group together, reminding them of the strange comedy of their condition. Over time, this reliance on cooperation shaped the very structure of human society. Other animals lived in packs, but humans leaned into collaboration with particular intensity. We invented rituals to reinforce it, dances where everyone stamped feet and breathed together, songs that forced lungs into the same rhythm, chants and prayers that synchronized groups in ways that made them feel united. These weren't just cultural flourishes. They were survival strategies written in breath. A group that breathed together, lived together. Even today, echoes of this strategy remain. Athletes synchronize breathing to coordinate movements. Choirs and bands rely on collective breath to create harmony. Families sigh together at the end of a long day. The comfort you feel when surrounded by others, breathing the same air, is a direct inheritance of the prehistoric truth. In a thin air world, cooperation wasn't optional. It was the only way forward. So when you lie in bed tonight, taking your own slow breaths, imagine your ancestors in their smoky caves, lungs straining, bodies exhausted, but still alive because they breathed not just for themselves, but with each other. Every shared inhale was a step toward the cooperative species we became. Our survival wasn't a solo performance, it was a choir of breath. Long before humans ever wheezed their way across the savannas, before the first fire crackled in a cave, the planet itself had already been working on a much bigger breath. Earth has lungs, not in the literal sense, but in the way its forests, swamps, and oceans exhale oxygen into the atmosphere. Without those ancient lungs, there would have been no humans to struggle, no predators to stalk, no life, as we know it at all. The story of oxygen is the story of plants quiet, patient, endlessly photosynthesizing. Billions of years ago, the air wasn't breathable. It was thick with carbon dioxide, methane, and other gases that would knock you out faster than a punch. Then came cyanobacteria, microscopic pioneers floating in ancient seas. They invented photosynthesis, that miraculous trick of turning sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide into food, and as a byproduct, releasing oxygen. At first, oxygen was toxic to most life. It killed as much as it saved. But over millions of years, the balance shifted. Oxygen built up, and the stage was set for complex life. Forests were Earth's later masterpiece. Vast swathes of towering plants pumped oxygen into the air. In the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago, oxygen levels spiked so high that dragonflies grew wingspans as wide as eagles. The Earth was practically overbreathing. Imagine taking a walk and finding insects the size of seagulls buzzing overhead, all because the atmosphere was rich enough to allow them to grow that way. But the Earth is moody. Oxygen levels didn't stay high forever. They rose and fell with climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, and mass extinctions. By the time humans arrived, the air was better than it had been, but nowhere near the luxurious abundance of those prehistoric forests. For early humans, forests were more than scenery. They were literal breath givers. Entering a wooded area after a trek across dry plains must have felt like stepping into a different world. Cooler, damper, and richer with oxygen, forests were refuges. The shade gave relief from the sun, and the plants themselves exhaled the very thing humans needed most. People may not have understood the chemistry, but they knew instinctively that staying near greenery meant easier breathing. It wasn't just trees. Grasses, mosses, even swampy reeds contributed to the slow exhale of oxygen. Swamps, in particular, were like giant filters, absorbing carbon and belching out air. For thousands of years, humans clustered near water and plants, following rivers and valleys where life felt more generous. These places weren't chosen just for food or water. They were chosen because the lungs of the earth worked harder there. But forests weren't always safe. Predators lurked in the shade. Poisonous plants grew alongside edible ones. Insects swarmed, some carrying disease. The very lungs that gave humans breath also tested their ingenuity. Survival in forests required knowledge: which trees offered fruit, which roots were safe, which clearings allowed a fire to burn, without suffocating everyone. It was another delicate dance between breath and danger. Over time, humans began to shape forests, as much as forests shaped them. Controlled burning, for instance, opened space, encouraged new growth, and altered oxygen flows. What began as accidental fire management turned into a kind of partnership. Humans, though still struggling with thin air, were learning to tweak the very systems that controlled the planet's breath. The slow rise of oxygen wasn't just about the past, it's still happening. Even today, the Amazon rainforest, Siberian taiga, and African jungles act like giant bellows, cycling air for the entire planet. Every lungful you take right now carries molecules that were exhaled by a tree, a patch of grass, or a microscopic algae. You are still breathing the lungs of the earth. For ancient humans, this connection was immediate. Their lives were fragile, their air was stingy, and their survival was tied to green things. They may not have named it photosynthesis, but they worshipped trees, rivers, and fields because, deep down, they understood these were the givers of breath. So, when you step into a park, or smell the damp air of a forest after rain, you are reconnecting with that ancient truth. The earth breathes, and through its slow, patient rise of oxygen, it gave us the chance to exist. We are the children of forests, of swamps, of algae floating in primeval seas. The lungs of the earth filled ours, and still do. Tonight, every breath you take in the quiet is another reminder that you are part of that great, endless rhythm. If the story of humanity were a long, winding novel, there would be chapters where the pages almost closed for good, points where the ink nearly stopped flowing, where the characters almost vanished entirely, leaving behind nothing but fossils and unanswered questions. Scientists call these episodes population bottlenecks, moments when our numbers shrank so drastically that the entire future of humanity balanced on the edge of a knife. And more than once, those bottlenecks were tied to the same invisible culprit: oxygen, or rather, the lack of it. Imagine a world where the air feels stingy, thin, and uncooperative. The atmosphere is not the generous 21% oxygen buffet we enjoy today. Instead, it's closer to a stingy waiter, offering only crumbs and pretending that's a meal. Every breath feels like trying to sip soup through a straw with a hole in it. That was the environment in which our ancestors found themselves again and again. Add in climate shifts, ice ages, and sudden environmental disasters, and you have the recipe for populations collapsing. One of the most famous of these bottlenecks may have happened around 900,000 years ago. Genetic evidence suggests that humanity's ancestors dwindled to a staggeringly small number, somewhere in the ballpark of just over 1,000 breeding individuals. That's fewer people than fit into a modern movie theater. Picture it. The entire human story, every future poet, warrior, farmer, and astronaut, all compressed into a fragile network of families scattered across Africa. If a single bad drought had lingered, if a single disease had spread, if predators had gotten a little luckier, we might not be here at all. Low oxygen made these bottlenecks even sharper. During ice ages, Oxygen levels in the atmosphere tended to dip. Colder oceans stored gases differently, changing the delicate balance of air. For humans already living on the edge of breathlessness, this was like having the air supply dialed down from barely enough to absolutely miserable. Weak lungs meant weaker immune systems, slower metabolisms, and more vulnerable bodies. Small groups of people huddled together, conserving energy, doing their best to pass on their genes, while the air itself seemed determined to thin their numbers further. The psychological strain must have been immense. Imagine sitting with your small band of relatives, watching the fires burn low, hearing the coughs of the sick, and wondering whether your people would see another generation. Every baby born was both hope and risk. Every death was a louder reminder that the group was shrinking. The silence between heartbeats, the pauses between shallow breaths, carried the weight of an entire species' survival. And yet, somehow, those fragile groups endured. Scientists sometimes describe it as luck, but luck alone doesn't last for 117,000 years, which is how long one bottleneck may have stretched. It was also adaptation, persistence, and the peculiar human ability to keep going even when all the odds say stop. These survivors weren't thriving. They weren't painting cave walls or carving jewelry. They were simply hanging on. Life at that point was about breath, food, and the stubbornness to push one more day forward. There's a strange comfort in knowing that our existence comes from such fragile beginnings. We are, all of us, descended from people who survived not just lions and famine, but the atmosphere itself. Our lungs carry the memory of those near-extinction moments, shaped by the relentless pressure of too little oxygen. Even our tendency to conserve energy, to nap, to sigh heavily, may trace back to ancestors who mastered the art of surviving in scarcity. So when you take a deep breath before falling asleep tonight, remember that it was not guaranteed. There were moments in history when the breath of humanity was almost extinguished. The fact that you can lie here now, warm and safe, inhaling deeply, is proof that a few thousand determined, breathless ancestors refused to give up when the air was at its thinnest. Long before humans wrote books or built monuments, they told stories. Around fires, in caves, under star-filled skies, they whispered, chanted, and sang. And some of those stories, it's possible, weren't just entertainment. They were survival guides, disguised as myths, rituals wrapped around the practical wisdom of living in a world where oxygen was scarce and every breath was precious. Imagine sitting in a cave, the firelight flickering on the walls, shadows turning into shapes. Someone begins a story about spirits who live in the wind. The tale warns that if you block the cave entrance, the spirits grow angry and steal your breath. On the surface, it sounds like superstition. But beneath the poetry, it's practical advice. Keep air flowing, or you'll suffocate. This is how air awareness may have been preserved, not in textbooks or lectures, but in stories that children remembered and repeated. Rituals, too, likely carried this hidden wisdom. Breath itself may have been sacred. Early chants, with their rhythmic inhaling and exhaling, synchronized groups and taught steady breathing. Dance, often performed in circles, may have doubled as a kind of communal lung exercise, training bodies to endure longer in thin air. Even prayer, whispered into the night, may have carried the dual function of calming the mind and regulating the breath. Consider smoke rituals. Many cultures, even today, burn herbs or incense as offerings. To ancient people, this might have served as a test. How does the smoke move in the cave? Does it drift out freely or hang heavy? If it lingers, the story says the spirits are displeased. But in reality, it was a warning about poor ventilation. Stories gave meaning to the invisible, turning life or death knowledge into memorable lessons. Myth also offered explanations for the strange sensations of low oxygen, that dizzy, floating feeling when you stood up too fast. Maybe it was your soul briefly leaving your body, the vivid dreams caused by shallow, oxygen-starved sleep. Perhaps they were visions from another world. Instead of treating these experiences as random discomfort, ancient humans wove them into spiritual narratives, keeping them in cultural memory. By turning physical struggles into mythic events, they ensured those experiences wouldn't be forgotten. And memory didn't just live in words. It lived in symbols, carved on bones, in handprints smeared on cave walls, in chants repeated across generations. The act of painting a cave might have been as much about marking a safe breathing space as about art. Stories about sacred groves or forbidden swamps may have guided groups toward places where the air was fresher, the oxygen richer. What appears to us as myth could easily have been practical memory wrapped in ritual. Even today, echoes of this awareness remain. Cultures around the world treat breath as life itself. Words for spirit and breath are often the same: pneuma, prana, ruach. Ancient languages remembered what survival demanded. Air is sacred. Without it, there is nothing. The rituals of yoga, meditation, and prayer may be modern survivals of prehistoric strategies, methods of teaching people to respect and regulate their most basic resource. So when you hear of wind gods, breath prayers, or rituals of smoke, you can imagine them as more than myth. They are memory, carrying forward the wisdom of people who once struggled nightly to survive in thin air. Their stories were not just entertainment. They were breath itself, preserved in words so their children, and their children's children, would never forget the invisible force that gave life and could so easily take it away. It's easy to imagine that comedy is a modern luxury, a product of late-night television, packed theaters, and people arguing over who the funniest stand-up is. But humor is older than civilization, older than farming, older even than the very languages we speak today. And in many ways, it was born out of struggle, not abundance. If you picture our ancestors stumbling through a thin-aired world, constantly dizzy, clumsy, and half-exhausted, you can begin to see how laughter might have come about not as a pastime, but as a survival tool. The first comedians didn't stand under spotlights. They sat around smoky fires, wheezing, coughing, and somehow finding the absurdity in it all. Life in a low-oxygen world was stressful. Every step was a reminder that your body was working harder than it wanted to. Every climb, every sprint, every task ended with that nagging feeling of not quite enough air. Add predators lurking in the shadows, and the constant threat of famine, and you've got a recipe for anxiety. Stress doesn't just live in the mind, it eats at the body, sapping energy, lowering immunity, and making survival even harder. But laughter, odd and surprising as it seems, offered a way out. A release valve, a way of shaking tension loose when breath itself was a scarce commodity. Imagine a small group gathered in a cave. The fire is burning, the children are tucked against their mothers, and one man, trying to demonstrate his bravery earlier, had sprinted after a rabbit, only to faint mid-chase. He's fine now, blinking sheepishly, and someone imitates his flop onto the ground. The others burst out laughing. The sound fills the cave, echoing off the walls. For a moment, the thin air doesn't matter. The heaviness in their chests lifts, replaced by something lighter. The group feels closer, stronger, not because the oxygen has changed, but because their minds have. Laughter rewired fear into relief. Scientists today know that laughter triggers the release of endorphins, those natural chemicals that soothe stress and create feelings of safety. Our ancestors didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the effect. After a good laugh, the body relaxes. The rhythm of breathing deepens, almost like a mini workout for the lungs. In a way, laughter was the earliest form of breathwork, sneaky lung training hidden inside silliness. It made people better at handling their breathless environment, one giggle at a time. The first comedians weren't telling polished jokes. They were mimics, exaggerators, storytellers. Someone stumbling over a rock became a full-blown routine when retold around the fire. Someone's loud snore became the centerpiece of a nighttime comedy act. Even the struggle of breathing itself might have been parodied mock gasps, playful wheezing, the ridiculous exaggeration of fainting on purpose to get a laugh. Humor turned their hardships into performances, transforming suffering into a shared source of amusement. And the beauty of laughter was that it was contagious. One chuckle could ripple through the whole group, creating a wave of synchronized breathing. In a thin-air world, that rhythm mattered. When everyone laughed together, their bodies reset, aligning breath, easing anxiety, and forging social bonds. Laughter wasn't just fun, it was glue. It pulled the group together, reminding them they were in it together, that even in a hostile world there was joy to be found. Humor also softened conflict. In small groups, tensions were inevitable. Someone took more than their share of food, or someone shirked their duty to gather wood. Anger in such conditions could fracture the group, and fractured groups didn't survive. But humor could diffuse a fight before it escalated. A well-timed joke could make the offender blush and the others laugh, shifting the mood from anger to camaraderie. The first comedians may have been peacekeepers, wielding humor like a shield against division. Of course, not everyone was equally funny. Even then, there must have been people who tried to make jokes and failed, greeted with silence or awkward coughs. But even that failure carried value. The attempt itself showed effort, a willingness to contribute to group spirit. Laughter, whether intentional or accidental, was one of the earliest social currencies. Those who could make others laugh earned trust, affection, maybe even better chances of finding a partner. In a very real sense, humor was sexy. A funny human was a valuable human. It's no wonder then that comedy stuck. It followed us from caves to villages, from firesides to amphitheaters. The DNA of that first fainting impression or clumsy reenactment lives in every stand-up special and sitcom today. What began as stress relief in a breathless world became a permanent part of who we are. When you laugh until your belly hurts, when your friends double over at a shared joke, you are reenacting something ancient, a ritual of survival, disguised as silliness. So picture those early humans again, wheezing, dizzy, stumbling in thin air. Now picture them laughing about it, the sound ringing through the cave. That laughter didn't change the oxygen levels, but it did change their will to keep going. And in that way, comedy became as vital as food or fire. It was not frivolous. It was the medicine of breathless times, the spark of joy that kept humanity alive long enough to tell jokes again tomorrow. For countless generations, humans lived in a world where the air seemed stingy, where every breath felt a little too shallow, a little too unsatisfying. But history is not static. Just as seasons shift and rivers change course, the atmosphere itself eventually began to transform. After long ages of scarcity, the Earth's oxygen levels started to rise again, slowly but steadily. And in that rise, humanity found relief not all at once, but like turning a corner after walking endlessly uphill and finally seeing the path slope downward. The reasons behind this climb were complex, woven into the planet's deep rhythms. Forests spread wider, oceans stirred differently, and the chemistry of Earth tilted toward generosity. Plant life expanded, releasing more oxygen into the air. Carbon that had been locked away during colder, harsher times began to cycle differently. In short, the Earth began to breathe deeper, and in that planetary inhale, humans could at last catch their own. Imagine the difference. For generations, a day of walking left people exhausted. Sprinting for even a minute risked collapse. Sleep was shallow, dreams restless. Now, with more oxygen available, suddenly, the world felt different. Muscles recovered faster. Brains sharpened. Babies born into this new air grew stronger, healthier. The daily fog of exhaustion began to lift, revealing possibilities that had been hidden behind breathlessness. With better oxygen came better energy. Humans could run farther, hunt longer, build bigger fires without suffocating. Social life flourished. Conversations became livelier, songs longer, dances more energetic. It wasn't just biology that shifted, it was culture. The very pace of life quickened as lungs filled more fully. Where before patience and slowness were survival tools, now bursts of activity became possible. People could risk more, explore farther, because they no longer lived constantly on the edge of collapse. This rise in oxygen also shaped the body in new ways. With more reliable fuel, brains grew larger, capable of supporting more complex thought, memory, and creativity. The leap from simple stone tools to intricate designs, from guttural sounds to structured language, coincided with this environmental generosity. It was as if the world itself finally allowed humanity to exhale, and in that exhale, imagination bloomed. Of course, the shift didn't happen overnight. It was subtle, stretched across millennia. No one woke up one morning and said, "Ah, the air is richer today." But across generations, the changes added up. Groups that had once teetered on the edge of extinction began to expand. Villages grew, populations spread. The bottlenecks that had nearly ended us opened wide, and humanity flowed through like a river, no longer dammed. It's tempting to romanticize this as a gift from the earth, but it was also a reminder of how fragile we are. The same atmosphere that once starved us now sustained us, but the balance was never guaranteed. Our species learned humility in those thin air centuries, and that memory lingered, even as oxygen levels rose. The stories of breath, of spirits in the wind, of sacred forests and vital fires remained. The culture of air awareness didn't vanish just because the air grew kinder. It rooted itself in ritual, in language, in the way we still treat breath as sacred. Turning the corner into richer air gave humanity a chance to thrive, but it also highlighted the razor-thin margin on which we live. Without those changes, without that slow rise of oxygen, there might be no songs, no paintings, no cities, no dreams. Just silence. A story cut short before it truly began. So tonight, as you breathe easily, deeply, without thinking, remember the long arc of that climb. Your lungs are the beneficiaries of forests, oceans, and billions of years of Earth's patient chemistry. You breathe freely because long ago, the planet itself turned a corner, and humanity followed. When the atmosphere finally began to loosen its grip, when oxygen levels climbed from stingy to generous, humanity entered what might be called its first great growth spurt. For ages, people had been limited by the invisible ceiling of thin air. Bodies were sluggish, thoughts foggy. Survival kept everyone focused on the basics of food, warmth, and not fainting at inconvenient times. But when the Earth began offering more oxygen, it was as if the brakes came off. The expansion that followed wasn't just about lungs feeling fuller. It was about population spreading, tools multiplying, and minds reaching into new territories of imagination. Think of it this way. For thousands of years, humanity had been living on a low-power mode, like a phone that dims its screen and shuts down apps just to keep the battery from dying. Every step, every breath, was carefully rationed. Then, all at once in evolutionary terms, someone flipped the settings back to normal. The battery charged faster, the screen brightened, and suddenly, there was energy to spare. That's what more oxygen meant to our ancestors. It was the difference between barely getting through the day and daring to try something new. First came the people. Populations that had been shrunk to tiny, fragile groups suddenly had the ability to grow. Babies were born stronger, mothers survived childbirth more often, and children could actually reach adulthood without constant crises. Families turned into clans, clans into tribes, tribes into sprawling networks of humans, moving into new landscapes. Where once the threat of extinction hovered like a constant shadow, now there was room for expansion, room to breathe. But expansion wasn't only about numbers. It was about what humans could do with their new reserves of energy. With fuller lungs and sharper brains, they began to experiment more boldly with tools. The clumsy flakes of stone that once sufficed gave way to carefully crafted blades, scrapers, and spear tips. The act of shaping rock into a tool requires patience, precision, and imagination. In a world of thin oxygen, that kind of concentration was a luxury. But in a richer atmosphere, people had the mental clarity and stamina to refine their craft. Stone tools evolved from crude hacks to elegant designs, evidence that humanity was no longer merely surviving but beginning to think about efficiency, even artistry. And where tools went, ideas followed. With more oxygen feeding bigger brains, humans became restless innovators. Fire, once a fragile secret barely kept alive, became a mastered skill, tamed and controlled. Cooking grew more sophisticated, diets diversified, and with every new technique came more energy, more growth, more expansion. The atmosphere didn't just fuel bodies, it fueled culture. Imagination bloomed, too. Cave paintings, beads, carved figurines. All of these artifacts appear as oxygen levels rose and human populations spread. For the first time, people could afford to spend precious energy on things that weren't strictly necessary for survival. They painted animals on walls, perhaps to honor the hunt, perhaps to tell stories, perhaps simply because they could. These creative bursts weren't frivolous. They were proof that humanity had reached a threshold where survival no longer consumed every ounce of effort. With fuller breaths came fuller minds. Expansion also meant exploration. As oxygen levels rose, humans could survive in more diverse climates. They spread from Africa into Europe, Asia, and eventually beyond. Each new environment demanded new tools, new strategies, new stories. Cold climates required tailored clothing, built with needles carved from bone. Rivers and coasts inspired the invention of boats and fishing techniques. Grasslands demanded cooperation in big game hunting. Everywhere humans went, they carried not just their bodies but their ideas, and the oxygen in their lungs powered it all. Of course, expansion had its costs. More people meant more competition for resources. Clashes between groups became inevitable. Yet even conflict spurred innovation. Better weapons, better strategies, better social structures to organize larger groups. The atmosphere didn't eliminate hardship. It simply gave humanity the energy to face it with greater creativity. When we think of expansion, it's easy to picture spreading maps, arrows moving across continents. But on the ground, expansion was felt in the rhythm of daily life. Families had more children and more energy to teach them. Campfires became gathering places for not just warmth, but storytelling. Tools were shared, traded, improved. Songs echoed farther, laughter carried longer. The air itself seemed to encourage not just survival, but connection. It's humbling to think that something as invisible as oxygen could shape everything we are. Without that rise, humanity might have remained small, fragile, and forever teetering on the brink. Instead, with fuller lungs, we expanded not only across the world, but into the realms of thought, imagination, and creativity. The breath of the planet became the breath of humanity, and in that shared inhale, history itself began to accelerate. Now, after this long story of breathlessness, near extinctions, clumsy stumbles, and stubborn persistence, we arrive at you lying comfortably in your bed, breathing without effort. The journey from those smoky caves to your cozy room is a story written in lungs, in air, in the invisible exchange between body and atmosphere. You might not notice it most of the time, but every deep sigh you take tonight carries the memory of millions of years when breathing wasn't easy at all. For our ancestors, each inhale was a gamble. They slept restlessly, lungs tugging at thin air. They woke dizzy, stumbled through tasks, and laughed about it to keep despair away. They shared warmth, stories, and firelight, all in the hope of making it one more day. Their survival strategies were born not of comfort, but of necessity, honed in a world where the air itself seemed stingy. Yet, somehow, they endured. They taught their children how to breathe in rhythm, how to pace themselves, how to live slowly when the body demanded slowness. You are here because they succeeded, because a few thousand fragile people clung to life through bottlenecks that should have ended the story, because they stumbled into fire, into tools, into rituals that kept the air moving through caves, because they learned to laugh when fainting and to share food when hungry. Their victories weren't grand. They were small, quiet, breath by breath. But stacked together, they built the psalm, foundation of your existence. Now, you breathe in a world where the atmosphere is generous. You can fill your lungs without thinking. You can walk, run, laugh, and sing without fainting after a few steps. You can dream freely, because oxygen fuels your brain, even in the deepest sleep. The struggle that defined our species for so long has softened into the background hum of modern life. Air is still invisible, still silent, but it no longer feels like a daily opponent. It's simply there, waiting for you. And yet, there's something grounding about remembering their struggle. It adds weight to every breath you take. Even now, you don't just breathe for yourself. You breathe for those who couldn't. For the countless generations who wheezed, coughed, and fainted, but kept moving forward anyway. For the ones who told stories about wind spirits, who laughed about clumsy falls, who painted walls by torchlight even when their lungs ached. Each inhale you take tonight is part of that unbroken chain. So as you lie there, blanket tucked around you, feel your chest rise and fall. Listen to the rhythm of your breath. Let it slow. Let it deepen. In this moment, you are safe. You are warm. You are surrounded not by predators or thin air, but by comfort. The ancestors who fought for every lungful would envy this, would marvel at your easy breathing. In a way, you are their reward, their proof that all that persistence was not in vain. Breathe in, breathe out. It's simple now. It wasn't always. And that's why it matters. Because eventually, humanity did learn to breathe easy. Eventually, the air grew generous, the lungs grew strong, and the story of survival became the story of thriving. You are the child of that story, the inheritor of those ancient breaths. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, remember that your breathing is more than habit. It is history. It is survival. It is the gift of every ancestor who refused to quit, who clung to life even when the atmosphere itself seemed against them. And now, you can close your eyes, let your breathing guide you, and finally, do what they longed for most. Rest in peace, with air enough to dream. And that brings us to the end of tonight's journey through the breathless world of our ancestors. Now it's your turn to rest, slow your breathing, sink into your pillow, and let sleep carry you gently away. If you're still awake though, don't worry. You can keep drifting with one of the 2 videos now on your screen. And if you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, make sure to subscribe. It helps keep these tales coming, and it means you'll never miss the next one. Sweet dreams, and good night.